Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Peter Rothstein, the president of NECEC, and it's my pleasure to welcome so many of you to this webinar. This is actually the first of what I know will be a series of discussions in the coming weeks, really focus on the COVID-19 response with issues that are really part of why we call this an emerging trend series. Issues around the health crisis, but also about the economic crisis and ways in which all of us can continue to work together and grow the clean energy sector. It's a pleasure to have Congressman Richard Neal with us as our special guest today. I'll be bringing him on in just a moment, along with Dan Bosley, for the first part of this conversation. This is a two-part conversation. We'll also, after that, have Jeff Haydock, who's NECEC CFO, and the head of ecoCFO to talk about issues from a CFO perspective. I think all of you know NECEC, our whole focus is about growing the clean energy industry and helping to accelerate the Northeast's clean economy. That continues to be a multi-year, multi-decade effort, but there's new issues that come up from time to time, and we certainly are in one of those today. I think many of you will have seen that in the last several weeks, we've put a COVID-19 response page up on our website as a channel to share with you updates from our friends in the public sector, as well as many of our sponsors and other collaborators. We've also started to do this sort of an event as well, and we will do more. We're committed to helping our member companies and stakeholders have access to information and the expertise from our network that is really critical to helping to navigate the economic and health crises that we're in these days. So thanks for joining us today for this COVID-19 response edition of our Emerging Trend Series. As we get this underway, I'm very thankful to be able to welcome Congressman Richard Neal, who is the congressman who represents the 1st Congressional District of Massachusetts in the U.S. House of Representatives. This is a district including 87 cities and towns in western and central Massachusetts. Congressman Neal is also chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee and is the dean of both the Massachusetts delegation and the New England congressional delegation. He's a strong supporter of the clean energy sector and in a very important leadership role to impact federal response to the COVID-19 crisis and all the related efforts that are critical around how we safely head toward economic relief and recovery. I also want to introduce Dan Bosley, who's part of the NECEC team. He's our government relations executive. Dan has served for more than 24 years in the Massachusetts legislature as a state representative from the 1st Berkshire District, also Western Mass, including in a key leadership position as chair of the Joint Committee on Energy at the time of electricity restructuring. Dan's going to be part of this conversation along with Congressman Neal, and both of them will be looking for your questions to ask as well. So let me just make a quick comment on that. You should all have access to a control panel. There should be a pull-down choice for questions there. If you have questions as we're going along, please enter them there. And in the latter part of this conversation, Congressman Neal and Dan will do their best to respond and pick up on some of your questions. So with that, I think we're ready to get this conversation underway. I'll turn it over to Dan and to Congressman Neal. Have at it.
Thank you very much, Peter. I appreciate that. And Congressman, thank you for doing this. I know that you've always been responsive on things like this, but I do know when I talked to your staff last week, that I was told, you know, we can do 2 o'clock, but we've got a leadership meeting with Nancy Pelosi, and we're trying to work out another bill. And I know how important that is, and I know how it's. I guess I'm just very thankful that you've taken time out of your very, very busy schedule to sit down and chat with us today, Congressman. We have many members in the NECEC that are both. Some are very large businesses, but most of them, a majority of them, are smaller to mid-sized to smaller businesses, and they're concerned. They're concerned about health, and they're concerned about their business, and they're concerned about getting through the rest of this crisis with COVID-19. And then the second crisis, I think, that we have is what we do about rebuilding. And All of these talks have been going on in Washington, and for the passage of the $2 trillion CARES Act. And I know that there's a tremendous amount of good things in there for businesses to try to help them get through this until we can get to the other side. So first, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about the CARES Act and talk about some of the things that the business community can look to for assistance.
Well, thanks, Dan, and thanks to Peter and all of you who have found time to spend a few minutes with me today talking about some of the issues that I think we pretty much align on. So what I might do, because I know that you have a keen interest in the development of proposals, what I thought I might do is just for a couple of minutes offer some context to how we came to some of the decisions that we reached on the CARES Act. And my God, just to talk about context today, as opposed to the emotions of the news cycle, it's refreshing. The challenge in front of us right now, obviously, is to address the health side of the pandemic. And it's our considered opinion that we are not going to get to the economic contagion that is occurring until we address the healthcare contagion from the coronavirus. And until people have the sense of confidence that the healthcare issue has been addressed, it's hard for me to envision how you're going to convince them to go back to the workplace. Even as we've developed these mechanisms for communicating, which I incidentally, you should know, I'm getting much better at after this challenge. But what we tried to do with the CARES Act, which is actually phase 3, it was to address the kind of looming consequence of what coronavirus was doing to the economy. So the decision came based upon individuals that I have relied upon for a considerable period of time, individuals that have, again, a keen interest in health and the economic consequence of the healthcare issue that's in front of us. And to come to some sort of reasoned approach that might speed up simultaneously the healthcare and economic recoveries. So the decision was largely to try to figure out, after talking to Bob Rubin and Hank Paulson and Jack Lew and Steve Ratner and Janet Yellen and spending time with Jay Powell at the Federal Reserve Board, we extensively went back and forth on how to address the issue in front of us. Getting cash into the hands of people in the middle and lower ends of the economic spectrum was a paramount concern, largely because for day-to-day sustenance, they needed it. Secondly, by spending it, they would help to create some demand. So for individual filers earning under $75,000 a year, there was a $1,200 check. There's a $500 check for dependent children, and for joint filers up to $150,000, a $2,400 check. 80 million checks have now been mailed. We thought that was very important. The suggestion, I also think, is that we're going to have to raise debit card allowances, limitations for people who live in areas where they depend upon TANF. That's a very important part of it. On the Paycheck Protection Act, it was also determined that trying to throw a lifeline to small businesses was essential. So we used sort of the prototype of what happens in Europe, not exactly the same one, but we would offer that lifeline in terms of keeping people employed. So you could benefit from the small business side of it, hopefully through some of the community bankers and others, because they would have a knowledge of the credit history of those that would seek some relief. But again, the plan was keep people working, even if in some cases they weren't working, were up to the same limits of what they previously had been working. The idea being, again, that an infusion of cash into the economy, keeping them going, it would enhance a faster recovery once we're able to put the virus issue and the healthcare issue. Unemployment insurance. We remind ourselves that the unemployment insurance system is a joint responsibility in America. It is the federal government and the state governments that set up the mechanisms. It's largely administered by the states. They set their own limits for how long one can derive an unemployment benefit. But in this instance here, we decided that we would offer an additional $600 beyond what the state unemployment insurance system would offer to those individuals. The system overnight was overwhelmed, as was the Paycheck Protection Act. So you can see the consistent theme here of money in the pipeline. For the Social Security Administration, that would be a little bit easier to address, largely because we know who the recipients are. So you would have the pipeline of getting the money out the door to them very quickly. For cities and towns, CDBG money. We know who those communities are, and we know what the pipeline is for delivery. On small business, we would know who they are because of their tax filing IDs. And all of these issues, again, were based upon get the money into the hands of the people who need it immediately. Now we're into the discussion of what to do after the first $350 billion was exhausted in 14 days. And in conversations with Secretary Mnuchin on Saturday, he indicated that he was fully supportive of our position that you had to get another $350 billion up and running. I would say that there are two pieces of advice that I received as I helped to assemble this document. Hank Paulson was of the position that immediately we should have done $750 billion, if not $1 trillion, for small business. Secondly, it was Janet Yellen who said, raise the cap from $50,000 to $75,000 for single filers. I think both of those have turned out to be accurate. We also think that here we are in terms of implementation. It's been rocky in some quarters. You don't do what we've done in 8 days and not expect that there would be some challenging moments. The dilemma was that the money was exhausted very quickly, and on the unemployment front, they were not able to set up the mechanism for getting the money out as quickly as we would have hoped. However, in fairness to those agencies, 22 million people in America have now filed for unemployment benefit. And I think that a little bit of patience here is really important. In conversations yesterday with the speaker, beginning at 1 o'clock and then again at 3 o'clock, we went back and forth on our position as we find ourselves between what I would call phase 3 and phase 4 in terms of implementation. So we would call it phase 3.5. More money for the Paycheck Protection Act for small business, and our request, aggressive request, that had to be accompanied by another $75 billion for our hospitals. $25 billion more for testing. Until the testing scenario plays out, it strikes me as being very difficult to convince people they're going to go back to work. Testing, testing, testing. Those remain our priorities. I think it's likely that we will reach an agreement, at least verbally, today or tomorrow. The majority leader has noticed the House that we intend to assemble at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning. Generally, there is a fairly arcane procedure you could use that if nobody objects, you would just need to have somebody in the chair and somebody on the floor making the motion and having it accepted by the chair, which would allow the legislation to pass. As you know, there was one recalcitrant who stood in the well of the House 3.5 weeks ago and was prepared to object. Nobody stood to offer support for a roll call vote, and the measure passed. Again, this all took place in 8 days. So what we're trying to do here is have something up and running on Wednesday morning. There likely still will be a phase 4 because this is not a partisan statement. Republicans have objected to the idea that we should offer an infusion of money to state and local governments right now. We did that in the first tranche. Here's the challenge. I think part of their strategy, and they have not shared it with me, but part of their strategy, I think, is their belief that if we send more money to state and local government, it will postpone the reopening of the economy. Now, that's what I surmise. I think that getting that money into their hands, because it's Republican governors and Democratic governors who are asking for the money. This is for people on the front lines, the police, the fire, people that do first responders work. And while that is unlikely to be in this package on Wednesday, we will have to do it in phase 4. So think of this stage right now more along the lines of relief and stability. The next phase will be one that I hope takes us toward recovery. Now, there are debates amongst all sorts of economists as to whether or not there will be a U-shaped recovery or a V-shaped recovery. But if we don't have the mechanisms in place and the money in place, it certainly will prolong the recovery. So I anticipate that the last phase, which Hank Paulson has said we're likely to need a phase 5, which I happen to agree with. It'll be a bit of a fight, but I also think that accepting the president's challenge of $2 trillion of money for the purpose of infrastructure would get to include many of the things that we'd like to do in partnership with you. Just before the virus struck, the Ways and Means tax staff that are on the line, they were in the midst of developing some pretty innovative legislation that we intended to put out this spring. So the work continues. They're on it, and I'm going to have them talk about it in a couple of minutes. But understand that in the phases of 4 and 5, which take us to recovery, I think a lot of the things that we would like to do as it relates to many of the similar interests that you have with me are things that we could accomplish. It'll take some innovation, some creativity, but at the same time, we all understand the nature of the challenge that is in front of us. We should take advantage of it. So with that, what I would like to do is have Andrew and Aruna talk about some of the things that we envision in the package that we would like to put out, that they've been working on for a year.
That sounds great, and I want to thank you. And just to buttress, I chair a bank board here in the Berkshires, and we have been inundated with payroll protection program applications, and we managed to process a lot of them, and we have a lot more that we need to process. And so we're looking forward to the 3.5 so that we can begin to do that again. And as when I was a state rep, I rewrote our unemployment laws twice, and so I understand the ability not just to get people who are unemployed their unemployment checks, but the $600 helps them to continue to put money into that local pipeline, to replicate in many places, and to replicate the kind of money that they had to spend in the economy. And even though there's a lot of stores shut down, there's a lot of people doing home deliveries, there's a lot of takeout, there's a lot of places where that money is spent on just basic necessities. So it does begin to wash that money through the economy, and I think does better position us for recovery when we finally get the stimulus bills. Yeah, we would be very interested to hear what you have to say on that, because if you take a look at a lot of the clean energy companies, they're energy efficiency companies, they're storage companies, they're solar companies. They're companies that can gear up relatively quickly and can put people back to work once we begin to loosen up and can go back to work. And I found it very interesting, Congressman, that when I was listening to different governors on the way back, I had to go to Albany the other day, and I was on the way back and I was listening to MSNBC, and I was listening to different governors, and the governor in Texas said, we're going to start to open up for business. But then he added the caveat, well, as soon as we can test, we'll open up for business. And then Charlie Baker was on from Massachusetts and said, we need to test so that we can open up for business. And so everybody's kind of going in the same direction. I think that $25 billion is going to go a long way towards people having the comfort that they need to be able to open up some of these businesses again.
So the issue here was speed and balance. So I'm hopeful that the testing issue in that perspective will be warmly welcomed by the administration. We'll see. But how about hearing from Andrew and from Aruna?
That'd be great.
Okay, great. Hi, Chairman Neal and Mr. Bosley. This is Aruna Kalyanam here. I thought it might make some sense to talk a little bit about what happened the last time we, encountered a great recession, an economic downturn like this, what the Congress did in the realm of green energy and efficiency investment, and how that really did a whole lot of good for revitalizing our energy industry, but also growing the industry in that sector of the economy to the point where it is. Now, understanding that we're at a point where it's particularly, it's just a very depressing outlook when we've halted our economy entirely. If you can imagine, back in 2009, you had some troubles with equity investors who actually were, whether or not they were able to monetize, whether or not they were able to take advantage of a tax credit in a very low tax appetite environment. I do believe you're going to find the same thing happening today, and that is what we've heard from almost all of our stakeholders here who've been calling in. Back in 2009, we enacted a provision that's affectionately referred to as the 1603 program, where we were able to, on a temporary basis, do cash grants out of an appropriation in lieu of tax credits. This sort of ensured that your investor base didn't fall away and were able to weather this downturn going forward. Right now, I think there's in my mind, there's two categories of what we can do here. There are certain things that are just, in particular, relaxation of rules that are hindering the green energy economy during this COVID-19 crisis. And then there are extensions and other things you can do to put people back to work. So I would put the direct pay piece in that category. I would also put an extension of the safe harbor rules that were done in 2016. We've heard from a number of people there that this would be extraordinarily beneficial to the wind industry in particular, but also to the solar industry. Now you kind of take a step beyond that. And I personally am a little bit baffled right now because, GM is just kind of in the worst spot possible. They're not making cars, they're making ventilators. And at the end of the day, we have an electric vehicle credit. GM had an amazing event about a month and a half ago, where they talked about how they're completely turning over their fleet to an almost all electric fleet. That is the future of the car company. Unfortunately, there is some political opposition to electric vehicles, but GM is in a strong position to talk about what they have been doing to stand up the economy and what they will be doing to stand up the greening of the fleet. I think that extensions of the Section 45 and 48 credits, in particular, those technologies that have been adversely impacted by what I would call about 10 years of neglect. I don't think we've done anything really major in the green energy space since the Recovery Act, and then we did about 5-year extensions of both of those credits in 2015 in the PATH Act. But we could do meaningful long-term extensions here, and I think those are sort of good down payments on really good jobs in this sector. You're talking about jobs that are nationwide, and they aren't sort of geographically tightened, similar to what some of the fossil fuel jobs are. Beyond that, I think there's a really good opportunity to expand some of the underpinnings of the green economy, like Chairman Neal and Mr. Bosley mentioned, including things like energy storage, and we can do also bond financing in the infrastructure realm that'll, again, underpin the greater deployment of green energy and energy efficiency. I was actually here on the committee and worked on the 2009 Recovery Act, so I have some experience here. I think the politics are going to be a little bit hard to negotiate this time as compared to then. We do have divided government, which we didn't have back then, which kind of results in slightly, they're not the same shared priorities we had before. But we have the committee has put together a really good draft bill that will form the basis or menu for what we're looking at doing here in this space. So with that, I'll go ahead and just go back on mute, and happy to take any questions.
Well,
How about some,
I'm sorry, go ahead, Mr. Chairman.
no, if you would like to ask some questions, I mean, with Aruna here, it would be a great opportunity to get some very good information.
Yeah, and let me reiterate that there is an opportunity to ask questions on your screen, and they will come up to us. And as they come up to us, we'll try to incorporate them in our conversation. I did want to just mention that, you know, before when we put up that we were going to have you on, Mr. Chairman, we immediately got dozens of people that signed up for this series, and some of the questions that they have sent to us ahead of time. Aruna answered the ITC direct pay, safe harbor extension. On the ITCs, you know, a couple of things that we didn't have in 2008 and 2009 were storage in particular. Standalone storage has become extremely important. You know, when we were doing electric restructuring 20 years ago, there was no storage, and now storage has become part of not just our lexicon, but part of everything that we construct today. So that was one question as to, you know, I think a suggestion that we extend the ITC for standalone storage, and also for offshore wind transmission systems. We're not building these things all in one piece anymore. There are companies that are coming in and talking about transmission. So our ability to extend ITCs to transmission, to have the offshore transmission be part of whatever federal stimulus package is allocated to states, and also just the frustration of dealing with the timeline for the Bureau of Ocean Management. This administration has not been forthcoming with a lot of the permits that we need, and so we need to be able to have some definitive timelines, and that's maybe something that wouldn't be in a stimulus package, but that we can work on also. So all of those things weren't around, you know, when we talked about this 12 years ago, and those are all integral pieces to what we do, as well as, you know, wind and solar and everything else that we did then and still do.
Well, coming as I did from local government, I also was very, very mindful of the challenges of opposition. Sometimes it's well-intentioned opposition, but I do think that as it relates to offshore wind, I think that's very important. And I really like storage because I think that I can't imagine anybody could be against expanding opportunities for more storage. And it seems to me as though it's really part of the answer. You have all these forces, as we know, that are taking place in the marketplace, even as we speak. And I've also discovered in my constituency, which you represented at one point, Dan, it's hard sometimes even to convince people about wind power in a part of the state where the wind really blows. And I remember being out, I won't get into the town, I went to this very small town in the constituency, and I think you represented it at one time, and this fellow who had been around for a long, long time, he was talking about they were going to put up a turbine. And he said, this is great, there's nobody against it. And he said, it's going to inure to the benefit of the citizenry here. They're going to help out the schools, they're going to help out police and fire. And he reiterated that there was no opposition. And I remember saying to him, don't worry, there will be. And I think that part of the challenge for all of us, we're getting ready this week to celebrate the 30th anniversary of building, at that time, one of, if not the largest recycling facilities in America. And I cited that when I was mayor. I can't tell you what that was like. And it was many of the people in the surrounding communities who loved recycling, but there was no way they were going to take that recycling facility. And I think that that's true now for more of us who we find people who invent arguments against the good things that we try to do that are entirely reasonable. And offshore wind is something that comes to mind. I think that that's part of the nature of the challenge that we have. So I'm happy to take a couple of more questions as well. I don't miss, Dan, you should know, and to the people that are with us, I don't miss zone changes, variances, or special permits.
Yeah, well, I represented a lot of small towns in the same small towns that you represent, and I got to tell you, both of us were involved in the largest wind project, on-land wind project with the Hoosick Wind Farm, and
Right.
you know the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that people slung at us, but it is a prime example of what we can do when we put our mind to it, and we can pass those objections, and we can get into that. And we need to do more. And I think offshore is a classic example of something that has tremendous potential, and especially in Massachusetts and New England. So I'm happy to see that. I did have a question about, in 2008, I think we put $20 billion in energy efficiency programs. And again, energy efficiency programs don't seem like, that doesn't seem like something that people should have any objections to. Those are the first, if you can avoid producing that power in the first place, we should be doing that. And that's front and center of any efforts. And I'm hopeful that, and I know that there have been some questions that have been sent to us on energy efficiency and whether or not there's any consideration of that in a stimulus bill that would come out.
Well, I will talk about that in a moment. I'll have Aruna address that. But, I as one who, I'm dating myself, I participated in the first Earth Day as a student at AIC. And I've never lost my bearing from that. But I do think that these arguments, as you know, as we attempt to approach these issues, they can become pretty challenging. And energy efficiency in appliances, what's happened in our homes, it's remarkable, just remarkable. But let me have Aruna address part of that question as well.
Sure. We have in the Green Act, in that discussion draft, there are a number of energy efficiency provisions, and we've done 5-year extensions of almost all of them. You're talking about energy efficient improvements to residences, the commercial building energy efficiency deduction. We also have a program that pluses up energy efficient manufacturing. It was the 48C program back when in 2009. But we do share jurisdiction on a lot of efficiency policies with the Energy and Commerce Committee. So they will be carrying part of the lift when it comes to the regulatory side, and we really take over the incentive side over this. A lot of these provisions, most of them, in fact, enjoy strong bipartisan support, and we are extremely hopeful that these will make it into a final package. I don't think I need to tell this group, because I'm sure they already know, some of the greatest decarbonization gain can come from increasing efficiency in our buildings, in our transportation, in our industry. And these are some of the lowest cost gains that are achievable in our economy, with kind of some of the greatest bang for your buck. So those are some of the areas: 25C, 25D, 179D, 48C. I'm sure I'm speaking to some of the tax lawyers in the room that will know that alphabet soup and is referencing some of the more popular code sections here.
That's great. Thank you, Aruna. Is there, I know we've only got a few more minutes, about 5 more minutes, Mr. Chairman. Are there other things that we need to know? Are there other things we could be doing now? I know you and I were on a phone call. We talked about work share. We talked about a better relationship with local banks. Are there other things we should be doing as an industry to position ourselves?
I mean, I think that what's important here is the conversation becomes pretty, as you know, polarizing frequently as we try to talk about some of these things. But I also think that 50 years out from the first Earth Day, to remind everybody of the progress that has been made and the success we've had with a lot of common sense solutions. So I think that using the tax code to incentivize certain behaviors is a plus. I mean, sometimes to get people to do things that you would like them to do that have a profound social benefit, if we use the tax system to promote that purpose, I think it makes a good deal of sense. And I know that even as we're speaking, that those conversations take place every day. And I hope that when the president said to me at the White House about a year ago, why not $2 trillion for infrastructure? I remember looking at him and saying, I'm in. you can count on me for that 2 trillion. And my point is that as we get to recovery, we're going to have a chance that might not come again to do a lot of these things. I mean, better investments in transportation, for example, as well as all of the other things that we'd like to do. Clean water, sewer and water, extended broadband. A lot of these things can take place. I mean, there are parts of America right now that don't have 911 service. It's pretty astounding. So as we do recovery, which will be phase 4 and or phase 5, I think there's a rare chance for all of us to get behind a lot of these issues, and using some of that money for investment for a better environmental and social outcome makes a good deal of sense.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that one of the things that I have heard on a lot of the talk shows, and I've heard a lot from the administration, is we need to do an infrastructure bill. And they talk about it in a traditional infrastructure sense, but from our perspective, I think that electric vehicle charging stations along our highways as we rebuild, adding that green infrastructure, grid investment, having an investment in our grid structure so that it becomes more reflective of what the new innovative grid is going to look like. I think that you know that the speaker, the Speaker of the House in Massachusetts has put a $1.3 billion bill in for Greenworks, for resiliency, for our cities and towns, to give them money and give them the expertise they need. And I think that's good. But, you know, Congressman, when we talk about infrastructure, everybody talks about, you know, the sea change and we need to build seawalls and we need to harden our infrastructure. But you and I see out in Western Massachusetts that it's changed maple syrup season, that it's changed our invasive species, that it's changed our tree lives out here. And so we see this too. And so if we're going to do an infrastructure bill, I would hope that we would take a look at doing something on the federal level that the state is trying to do on resiliency and trying to harden our infrastructure and trying to prepare for what the future is going to look like. And I think that's going to be very important, that we take a new look at the old infrastructure bills.
I agree, and you should know I'd let you be party to part of the conversation that took place with Secretary Mnuchin. He indicated to me on Saturday, we've gone back and forth. We have breakfast once a month to talk through these issues, and he reiterated to me, once this calms, we're going to infrastructure.
I think that's important. I think it's important that and it's important to the work that you've done on trying to train people and put money into training programs is extremely important too, because the people that are out aren't necessarily the people who are going to be able to do that infrastructure. And so that's extremely important. I want to thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, I know we've got a few minutes left. I just wanted to ask you, we talked about phase 4 and phase 5 and trying to do these. Is there, I'm just going to ask you to prognosticate, because it really depends on testing and it depends on health, but what do you feel kind of general timelines on that kind of thing? When should we be looking to try to advocate or try to, you know, buttress your position and give you the kind of support you need? When should we be looking for phase 4 or phase 5?
Well, I think that if we could find an agreement today or with the Senate and then tomorrow with the House and then vote on it on Wednesday, I think that we right now start planning for phase 4, because a lot of the pieces are already there. State and local government, for example, it's going to have to be done.
Yeah.
And they've exhausted a lot of their overtime, and we're going to have to respond to those issues accordingly. So I think that I can see what phase 4 and phase 5 would look like. And I certainly can tell you that the staff, we've done a lot of thinking about what phase 4 and 5 would be like, but it's a chance to remake so many of the priorities that we've longed for in America for a considerable period of time.
I'm getting questions as we're going. I know we've got a minute or two left. Well, let me leave it at that. Let me leave it at that and just say this. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your time. I know you got a 3 o'clock meeting, and I know that you've got to go at 1:15, and it's just about 1:15 now. I just want to thank you so much. Whatever we can do to support your positions, we're an industry that wants to go back to work as soon as we possibly can. We can gear up and with the added benefit of making the world greener. So we're ready to assist you any way that we can, and we really appreciate you being with us today.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks to all of you who dialed in.
Thank you. I would like to turn this back to Peter Rothstein to say thanks and to introduce Jeff Haydock.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Congressman Neal. Great conversation, very timely in so many ways, and I will reiterate, Dan, the way you left that, which is, and the Congressman, we're very excited at NECEC to do whatever we can to engage our member companies and share insights with you and your staff and your committee as some of these issues and opportunities move forward. Not quite sure if we'll all be on airplanes going down to DC in person in the next handful of weeks, but we certainly are ready to organize these kinds of virtual conversations and communities and look forward to how that can be really valuable to the region and to the country. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dan, for facilitating that conversation. Nice to know.
Thank you.
So with that, I'm going to then move us forward to the next part of this webinar. And Jeff Haydock is joining us for this piece. Jeff plays two roles. Jeff is the outsourced CFO for NECEC. He and his team work very closely with us. He also leads an organization called ecoCFO, where he's the president and CEO. ecoCFO is focused on outsourced CFO services for the clean tech industry. And so Jeff is working not only with us, but with a cross-section of our members and emerging companies, and has been in the middle of some of the payroll protection program efforts creating opportunities for small businesses. So we asked Jeff to take a little bit of time and to share some of his insights on these topics as well. And we'll also have a short amount of time for Jeff to take some questions at the end. So please remember to keep questions coming in. So Jeff, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Peter. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this from the CFO perspective on how to plan and prepare for moments in time like this. This sort of reminds me a little bit of 2008 when we had major cash crises and that sort of things, although this experience is much different than that in terms of the underlying causes or reasons for this sort of thing. But Sean, go ahead into the next slide. So the first thing that we really should be doing, or everybody should be doing, is assessing the own health of the organization or your company, and you need the right tools in order to be able to do that. So I'm going to run through probably the most helpful and often overlooked management tool that should be used in order to assess the own health of the company and what your options are and how to position yourself in situations like this. Not everybody is in survival mode. There are some that are in a position of strength, but I think everybody for the most part is most concerned with surviving this. So we're going to talk a little bit about cash flow forecasts. Sean, if you would go to the next slide, please. So here's 4 sort of stress test questions that you should ask yourself. The first one actually being, do I have a cash flow forecast? And if the answer to that question is no, you're not alone. Again, it's very often overlooked, but is very helpful and something that we should be prioritizing. So if you ask yourself these 4 questions, we can sort of start to get our arms around what how functional your forecast is. And first question, how many months of cash do I have on hand? If the answer to this question is either I don't know or less than 3, then we're either flying blind or too close to the sun. We should always be aiming to have at least 3 months of cash on hand. And there's a wide variety of things that we can do, when we have the resources and the cash and the liquidity available. Question number 2, if your forecast is not giving you the information that you need to be able to forecast how much cash you'll have in some longer period of time, 3, 6, 12, 18 months, then that's sort of our next task, is to get it structured in such a way that it'll do so. I think going out further than that, generally not very helpful. I think the longest forecast that we have ever used effectively has been about 2.5 years, and that was for the purpose of a runway calculation after closing an A round, which was used well. But I think this stuff changes so frequently that trying to go out much farther than 12 or 18 months can be very difficult. But at minimum, 12 months, especially if you're seasonal. I mean, we have so many solar folks on this call, and it's such a seasonal industry that If you're not able to forecast cash out at least 12 months, then that's something you should put on your to-do list. Weekly cash flow forecasting. So it's not necessarily something that everybody needs to be able to do, but when you get into that range of having less than 3 months of cash, then it's something that you should do. And we see a lot of this as we're tracking runway towards the end of a round and preparing for another financing event. We also see this in companies that run with thin margins. Having your arms around milestones on a weekly basis as opposed to a monthly basis can make all the difference in the world when you're trying to figure out if you're going to be able to make payroll in 6 weeks. And then last, the granularity to be able to adjust actual inflows and outflows, both in timing and dollar amounts. A lot of times folks will use approximations on revenue or expenses, some percentage of overhead or payroll being some percentage of your total outflow. But in order to really accurately do this, I should be able to ask or manipulate, what, XYZ customer, they're 30 days overdue on my AR already, but what if they go 60 days or 90 days? I should have the ability to move money around in a forecast to that level of granularity. Same thing with any vendors and payroll and debt payments. If one of the easiest levers to pull here right now is to be able to work with your bank on deferring payments, which again, this is a major difference from 2008 when there was just no credit or liquidity. But we should be able to adjust all of our major items to be able to tinker with different scenarios to figure out when we'll be able to rehire, when will we be able to pay our vendors, how hard do we need to push on customers, et cetera, in order to bring in cash. So if you ask yourself those questions and you feel comfortable with the answers, then great, then we can start to do, or you can start to do some tinkering with different scenarios to figure out how to get through this situation. But if you don't know the answer to those questions, then that should be a sign to you that it's time to build a more robust forecast. Next slide, Sean. So 4 keys to manufacture some liquidity here. AR and AP, think of this as like tug of war with a bungee cord, and the bungee cord is your liquidity. You want to be pulling as hard as you can on all your AR to bring cash in as soon as you can. That seems like a no-brainer, but in a time like this, you're not the only one that's trying to do it. So you want to get out in front of it. We see a lot of payment plans that are popping up now. Pay me 40% now, 40% in a month, and 20% in 6 weeks. Something along those lines. But sometimes it's really all about knowing when you'll receive cash as opposed to anything else. It's in order to properly plan and forecast, it's sometimes just having that level of detail is really important. And on the flip side, it's the same thing. I mean, all of your customers are going to be wanting to know the same thing that you want to know from yours. So being able to work out payment plans with vendors, I think usually we find that people generally want to help. They want to be flexible because it's in everybody's best interest as opposed to having some sort of contract dispute or legal issue. Everybody generally wants to help, but you have to communicate. And again, you're not the only one in this situation. So, your vendors and customers are probably hearing this from many people. So it's best to get out in front of it. With regards to payroll, so I'm not going to touch too much on Paycheck Protection Program or the Family First Coronavirus Recovery Act. I think there have been a lot of webinars done by experts on this subject. I will say that, again, this is a difference from prior cash crunch time periods where these weren't options that were available to us, and they have been designed to create liquidity during this period of time that is very uncertain. So if you haven't yet attempted to take advantage of it, you should reach out to your bank with regards to PPP and how they're handling an anticipated next round of funds made available. If there is another round of funds made available, if you're not aware, all $349 billion was earmarked as of the end of last week. But from an employer cost perspective, some of the things that we're seeing folks do is little things, or you might suspend 401k match, we've seen happen in a couple of places. Some folks are reducing hours to 30 or 32 hours a week to maintain eligibility for health insurance for employees, but it helps save a little bit in payroll costs. And then there's of course the dreaded pay cut. But what we have seen one group do actually, which I thought was pretty creative, was they compensated employees that took a pay cut in exchange with stock options in the company. So it's a good retention tool and a nice way to sort of soften the pain of having to ask employees to take pay cuts. with regards to capitalization, cash, debt, and equity. So another good example here is we had a client that has a letter of credit posted that's collateralized entirely by cash, about $2 million worth. And, they needed to free up that cash. They approached the landlord and said, is there something we can do to have this letter of credit released? And, they had put a multiple of that into the building in terms of leasehold improvements, and the landlord agreed to collateralize the improvements and release the letter of credit. So they freed up $2 million in cash that way. So, review restricted cash accounts, review your liabilities. We're seeing banks, again, trying to be helpful and in deferring payments. And so you should explore that if you have not already, if you have any loans outstanding. And then additionally, if you're a funded startup, you may have convertible notes in your cap table. We're seeing a lot of folks planning to do sort of bridge rounds on the same terms as a previous note round. We've seen that happen. So, it's something else to consider in an effort to try and bring a financing round together more quickly than otherwise would, because at the same time, everything is taking longer than it usually does. We have somebody that's trying to close a round now that's been dragging on for a number of weeks, and so everything is just taking longer than it otherwise should. So again, communicate on this. The sooner you get out in front of it and talk to your banker, talk to your investors, everybody wants to help, but you have to ask. And then lastly, payment methods. Folks that receive paper checks, we're having to void and reissue checks because folks aren't in the office for deposits. So if you can do payments, either outflows or inflows, receiving or paying electronically, go for it. However, with the caveat that the phishing attempts and the payment fraud is getting more and more sophisticated every week. And during a time like this, it's just ripe for opportunity for hackers and whatnot. And one tip that I would give you is that with no exceptions, anytime you process a wire or change banking information for a customer, you always call and verbally confirm wire instructions or banking information with somebody on the other end of the phone that you recognize. It seems like a basic tip, but you'd be surprised at how many attempts at fraud have been caught this way or could have been prevented if it had been done. Sean, next slide, please. And then the last thought that I'll sort of leave you with here is that if you have gone through the analysis and you've run the scenarios and you are in a position of strength, now is a very unique time to acquire assets and resources. Moments in time like this are ripe for change and turnover. People are available that wouldn't have otherwise been available. They've been laid off or terminated or unhappy in a situation or what have you. So, now is a great time, if you are in a position to do it, to acquire resources and assets, whatever it may be, as things are discounted or available that might not otherwise have been. So, having a functional forecast in place to be able to determine the health of the company and at the same time, forecast out new hires or new asset acquisitions, et cetera, is just the building block in order to be able to do this in an educated way. Next slide. And I'll just leave you with this last statistic. I mean, there's power in numbers. Clean energy sector has grown substantially. I remember when the Mass Clean Energy Center was the Mass Technology Collaborative. A lot has changed in 10 years. And there is strength in this community and this industry that there hasn't been a long time ago. And I think that plays a large role in effective policymaking, which is a huge reason to, I'm also a member of NECEC. It's a great reason to support and be part of organizations like this to defend you on your behalf with regulators and lawmakers. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Peter or take any questions that anybody might have. And I'll check my question section here. Otherwise, Peter, I'll turn it back over to you.
There are questions coming your way, or Sean or Kate could help handle those over. But Jeff, I would say thank you very much. Very informative and great sense of I think the importance of both fundamental financial management and planning, but especially at a time with the kind of uncertainty that exists right now, and where and the pace of change, things are changing daily.
They definitely are.
Jeff and Peter, this is Kate. We do have one question that came in from a member of the audience. Other than the PPP, what CARE Act pieces have been most popular with your clients, Jeff?
Yeah, so as the dust has settled on PPP, because that definitely attracted everybody's attention for the first week or two, trying to understand and digest and all the rules and regs associated with it, not to mention they're changing on a daily basis. But the EIDL, the Economic Impact Disaster Loans, were also a great program, although that looks like that's been, pretty much cut, as well as it has been oversubscribed. So from a liquidity generating perspective, there were those two programs via the SBA, but I'm also seeing a lot with the Families First Coronavirus Recovery Act. You have three good avenues in order to support employees that have to take leave for a number of reasons. Either A, they've tested positive for coronavirus, B, they have to care for family members that have tested positive, or C, they have to stay home and can't really work because they have to care for children with school closures. In any one of those three scenarios, there is support available from the federal government to the employer so that the employee can stay on payroll and soften some of that expense to the employer. So if you're not familiar with that program, I would suggest taking a look at that and discussing it with your HR function or consultant to sort of explore that and see if there might be some possibilities there as well.
Great, thanks. And I think Dan Bosley is going to join us back for a second. He had a couple of questions for you too, Jeff.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Thanks, Jeff. Not so much questions, but I thought that was an excellent presentation. I just wanted to add two things. One was on the working part-time, keeping your employees part-time. I think the work share programs that every state in our 7 states that we deal with has a work share program, and I think those are just so important, because if you can't keep somebody on full-time, you can keep them on part-time and they can collect unemployment, and it's a great program. And I think that one of the problems, and you hit on this, is that people aren't sure as to when they're going to go back to work. And I was talking to one person in my old district, because you never stop getting phone calls, and the person was saying that they laid everybody off because they weren't sure how long this is going to take to get back to work. Is it going to be 1 month, 2 months, 3 months? And I think that you're telling people to kind of marshal your cash flow and figure out your receivables. And I know that one of the things that I've been suggesting is that if people are on automatic payments, get off automatic payments, see if they can cut a deal with whoever that is. And then finally, through the bank that I'm chair of the Mountain One Bank Board, and we have branches in just south of Boston on the South Shore and out here in the Berkshires. And we've been working with people. And if there's one piece of advice that I can give businesses, is that talk to your bank, because that relationship just shouldn't be there when you're in trouble. But you need to be able to communicate with your bank and tell them. I think if you talk through things, it helps you to plan, but it also helps to prepare the bank. And I know right now we're giving 120 days moratorium before the state said we had to, because businesses just need some opportunity to breathe and to figure out where they are. So it's really important to communicate with that local bank.
Yeah, Dan, the particularly with PPP, everybody seems to be worked up about loan forgiveness, but I think we should take a step back and just remember that this is a 2-year term loan at 0.5% interest. That if you're asking yourself, when is the right time to hire? Because we had the same situation happen. We had somebody lay off everybody immediately, and then they just got PPP and they're figuring out how to hire everybody back. But at the same time, they're just asking themselves, if this just continues on for 2 or 3 months and I don't have revenue returning to what it was prior to, then I'm just going to have to lay these folks off again. And something about that doesn't really seem helpful. Well, my thought on it is, this is intended to be, yes, it's intended to be a forgiven loan, but even if it's not forgiven, it's still very cheap money, and it is a loan with a full guarantee from the SBA. So even if the full amount isn't forgiven, it still generates liquidity in a time where everybody is searching for it on really favorable terms. So maybe don't get caught up in 100% forgiveness, and if you do have to repay some of it, it still served its purpose in sort of leveling out the volatility that exists right now.
Thank you, Jeff, and thanks, Dan, as well, chiming in on some of that. I think there's this whole category of when will we be back at work is really a much bigger and more diverse conversation that I think we're going to continue. We're going to be having much more in the coming weeks, because it's really about all the unique aspects of what kind of work you do and how to update your business practices to add appropriate amounts of safety for both yourselves, but also your customers, your partners, et cetera. And I think that's an area where we've had a number of people suggest topics for additional webinars and perhaps some working groups that would develop some shared approaches within different sectors. Because I think going back to work in careful degrees and in various stages is going to have to be very well informed by the practice and the safety approaches and the communication with stakeholders around all of that. And so that just builds, Jeff, on everything you were just talking about, and Dan as well. So thank you all very much. Thanks everybody for joining us and attending today. We will be posting a recording of this, so watch for that update. We will continue to be posting updates around COVID-19, whether it's on the policy or public sector side or business practices, any of those sorts of areas, or other services from NECEC sponsors. Take a look at the COVID-19 response page on our website. Continue to send thoughts our way on the next webinars, and here are a couple that are coming up. A one-on-one with seed and Series A investors on April 13th. That is coming up. That is part of our Navigate program. And then an emerging trend series, which will be completely online and virtual. At both of these events will be. The emerging trend series is focused on new business models for electrification. That's on May 6th. So please join us. They'll be listed under our events on our events page on the NECEC website. You can sign up and continue to feed us questions, and we will continue the virtual conversations around all of these topics. Thanks for being a part of it. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Congressman Neal, as well. Thanks, everyone, for being part of this today.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Peter.